Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. And this is my 1997 Dodge Ram 3500 with the second generation 12 valve Cummins diesel engine in it. And those of you who watch my channel regularly may have seen this truck before and noticed that it is not white anymore. Had all the body work done, all the rot taken care of, and had it painted, and we went with this kind of a neat looking blue color. But anyways, the reason why I'm working on it today is for a while now this truck seems to have not had the power that it's supposed to have, and I think it was a gradual loss of power or degradation in overall power output, and it was kind of not really noticeable to me so much until last year. We bought what you see in the background here is the back of our Grand Design Solitude fifth wheel trailer. Now, we had a fifth wheel trailer prior to this, but this particular fifth wheel trailer is several thousand pounds heavier, and that's when we really started to notice, I got to do something about the power on this thing. So thought, well, you know, I could do things like maybe do a aftermarket turbo like a Banks or something like that, could turn up the fuel. There's all kinds of different mods I could do, but I want to find out whether or not just making sure this thing is running properly stock isn't going to be enough to solve my power issues. So when I had the transmission work done on this truck, the guy who ran the transmission shop, when he was road testing me, he says, you know, your transmission's working good now, but he says, you know, I got to tell you, he says, I've driven a few of these trucks and this thing doesn't really seem to be, you know, doesn't seem to be putting out the power, doesn't seem to have the zip that other ones that I've had in here, stock ones. So let's take a quick look under the hood and talk about what I'm going to be looking for. So anybody who's worked on motors before and gasoline engines knows that there's three basic things you need. You need compression, you need fuel, and you need spark or ignition. Well, with a diesel, really it's more about compression, air, and fuel. There is no ignition. It's the pressurization of the fuel-air mixture that actually creates ignition. So they operate under very high pressure. So your fuel injection system on these has to operate at a very high pressure. And that pressure is generated by the fuel injection pump or the high pressure pump. What makes these Dodge 12 valves so legendarily reliable in part is the fact that they use this Bosch, what is commonly referred to as a P-pump. And the Bosch P-pump is an all mechanical fuel injection pump. So this is the high pressure pump right here. And what this does is this takes the lower pressure from another pump called the lift pump and changes that into the extremely high pressure that is sent through these rigid steel valves over to the individual injectors on the individual cylinders. But this pump is not designed to be able to suck the fuel out of the fuel tank, which is lower than this pump. This is up here on the top of the engine, and the fuel tank's down in the back of the truck and low down. So you've got to get the fuel out of that tank, get sucked out through almost like a straw out of the top of the tank, and then up and brought up to the input of this pump here. That is accomplished by another pump called the lift pump. So it's kind of hard to see it down in this mess, but the lift pump is actually mounted on the side of the engine block down lower. It's actually operated off of a lobe of the camshaft that actually mechanically pushes a plunger and operates that lift pump. So that lift pump draws the fuel out of the tank and then pressurizes it to about 20 pounds psi at idle and somewhere around 35 pounds at like 2000 rpm, and then that comes up and goes into the goes through the fuel filter and goes into the high pressure pump right at this point right here on the back side. So it might not be focusing really well, but it's literally right here. This line right here goes down into the side of the high pressure pump. So it's that fitting right there. So the steel line comes in right there. Now, in order to ensure that the pump has proper operating pressure through a varied number of circumstances, different loads on the engine, different RPMs and whatnot, the design is such that the pump will actually send, under normal operating conditions, more pressure to the input over here than is required. And then through an ingenious system, they have an overflow right here. This is where the excess fuel that's not needed comes back out of the pump and returns to the tank. And then this device right here is actually a special spring-loaded ball check type valve. And what this does is this acts as a regulator and regulates the pressure coming into the pump. So the way it works is, if you have excess pressure coming into the pump here and the pump doesn't need it, that pressure will act on that ball check valve and push that ball open against the spring, push that ball out of position against the spring, and allow fuel to bypass that ball and go out another line back to the tank. If the fuel pressure starts to drop inside this pump because, say, a lot more fuel is going to the injectors because the truck's working hard, like going up a hill, well, then consequently what will happen is the spring in there will cause that ball to close down that opening, and you'll have less fuel going back to the tank to maintain the pressure inside the pump. The reason why I'm telling you all this is because this is a very common failure point on these trucks. This special check valve can go bad. You can have the spring break, or the spring just get weak, or any number of other possibilities that can cause that to fail. Bosch makes a replacement, but my understanding is that there is one made by a company called Torque Tech that is supposedly far superior to the Bosch ones, and that's what everybody tends to change these to. So how do you determine whether or not that's bad? Well, it's the same way that you determine whether or not your lift pump is bad. What we end up doing is we end up doing a fuel pressure test on the inlet side of the high volume, the high pressure pump here, and we look at that pressure at idle and at 2000 RPM, and we see if it's too low. If it's too low, there's a couple of possibilities. We could have a restriction, like a dirty fuel filter. We could have a leak, so that some of the pressure, but a leak would be pretty obvious, right? Or what could be happening is you could have a pump that's worn out and isn't able to generate the amount of pressure, but a low pressure indication could also mean a problem with this valve not closing down properly because of a problem with the spring in there, right? So what you can do is you can take a pressure test of the output of that pump, and if it's low, you can actually find where this line goes back and transitions to a rubber return line, rubber hose underneath the truck, and you can clamp that off with a pair of smooth-jawed pliers, hose pliers. Literally, you do the job that this thing's supposed to do, which is shut down that return line, and you see whether or not your fuel pressure reading rises. If it does, and you can get to a normal level, well, that's a good indicator that this is your problem and not your pump. If there's no change, then chances are you've got a bad pump. And I've even seen some videos where the guys had both that they had to replace, the pump and this. So I think what I'm going to do for starters is I'm going to do a fuel pressure test on that lift pump output. And then if I'm satisfied with the way that looks, then I'm going to go to my other suspected culprit, which is boost. So from what I've read, apparently there's two places where you can tap off the fuel system to get that pressure reading off the lift pump. One of which is right here on top of the fuel filter. There's a 10 millimeter bolt you can take out. It's a bleeder screw, and some people say you can take that out and put a fitting in there, but that screw is so small. Then there's also a special fitting you can get where you remove the banjo bolt itself and replace that banjo bolt with the special banjo bolt that will give you a port that you can then screw an adapter into and then put your gauge on there. But the other place where you can get the reading is this big banjo bolt here, which is a 19 millimeter, right on the pump itself. Apparently, from what I've read, if you take the reading here, it's a more accurate reading. Now, again, there is no hole or anything in this. You have to remove this banjo bolt and put in a special fitting. Now, the fittings that people put in here are called snubbers, and they aren't just adapters, but they also have an orifice in them that acts to dampen spikes. If you do not have an actual snubber fitting in here and you hook up a pressure gauge, the gauge is going to bounce around, and you're going to see that because I'm going to not buy the special snubber. I'm going to remove this banjo bolt and modify it by drilling a hole and tapping threads in it so that I can put an adapter on there. And it's a good idea to have a container underneath that bolt when you take it out, because you are going to have some fuel come out. So I want to drill a smaller pilot hole first, but what I just did there was the 11/32 inch drill bit fits almost perfectly, so this end acts as a guide. So instead of having to try and center punch the exact center of this, I just use this as a guide. I use the 11/32 inch drill bit just to start the hole so that I can get the center point of the drill bit to give me a little center dimple that I can now use to guide starting a smaller drill bit for the pilot hole. Alright, so I tapped the threads in here. Didn't bother showing that, but pretty basic. And then I got myself a barbed adapter, 1/8 inch national pipe thread, which is what my tap was. And I'll tighten that in there. Probably just put a little bit of Teflon tape on there. So yeah, this only goes up to 10 psi, this gauge. So I don't know what the hell I was thinking. You know, I used this on the GM diesel without any problems, so that's what made me not really pay attention to the gauge here. And it goes up to 30 on the vacuum side, so that's probably what threw me off. But I've got to change this gauge because this one is not going to work out for us. So O'Reilly Auto Parts store to the rescue. Their rental tool program. This is the fuel pressure test kit, and it's $149.99 plus tax. You can rent it, and as long as you bring it back within 24 hours, I think 24 hours or something like that, 36, whatever, and you don't break it, they'll give you your money back. And what's included in here is a test gauge that goes up to 100 psi. So we will be able to use this. I've just got to find a way to adapt these funky fittings that are on here to my hose that I've got on here. We'll be good to go. So the problem is that this kit is really made for measuring the pressure on the rail on fuel injection systems on automotive gas cars. So that's why it can measure high pressure. So it comes with a whole slew of different types of fittings that are all made to have one end that this can screw onto, and then the other end screws onto different ports and different automobiles, different brands. None of that's going to work for me. If I take a barbed fitting like this out of my collection of stuff, well, that threads into here, no problem, but because it's not made to seat in here correctly, that is going to just leak like crazy, so that's not going to work. So my only choice I have is, there is this adapter in the kit, So this is clearly to go in line on a rubber hose fuel line. So the idea would be we would find a place in the fuel system where I could cut the hose and put this in place and then hook up my pressure gauge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to use this adapter on the end of my hose that I've already installed, which hopefully I can get this to stretch on there. Yep, that'll work. Okay. The kit comes with a couple little short hunks of hose. So all I've got to do is put one of these short hunks of hose on here and find something to plug the other end of the hose. Alright, so here's the setup. I used the inline T. I put this little short stub here. The kit actually comes with a couple extra clamps, which is nice. And I hobbled together this little thing here as a plug, which is a barbed adapter to a threaded reducer to a pipe plug, because I couldn't do it in one step. But anyways, that'll work.
Exactly where it should be, about 22 psi.
Okay, so yeah, that should be making more pressure than that. So I just saw online that it's supposed to be 18 to 24 at idle and 26 to 35 at 2,000 RPM. So I just double checked to make sure I was reading that right. I got 25. At 2,000 RPM, I've got 25. At idle, I've got like 22. So it seems like plenty healthy of pressure at idle. At 2,000 RPM, I got 1 PSI below spec? Huh. Does that really constitute a problem? Alright, so I know my fuel pressure is not going high enough when I hit 2,000 RPM. So the question is it a problem with the lift pump not being able to develop enough pressure because the pump is worn out, or there's some sort of a restriction in the supply side? Or is it a problem with the bypass valve right here? So remember, I explained that when the pressure gets to a certain point, this bypass valve will start to open and allow excess pressure to go back to the fuel tank on the return line. But if this valve is worn and the spring that makes the ball stay closed in there is weak or broken, it can allow the pressure to leak past this valve prematurely. So it's real simple to test this theory of whether or not this is bad. All we have to do is crimp off the return line going back to the tank while the engine's running, and we'll see whether or not the pressure goes up. The pressure should go way up, like 50 or 60 pounds. And that will tell us that the pump is more than able to develop the pressure, and that the problem is in fact this valve. If with that line crimped off, we can't develop enough pressure still, then we still have to figure that it's either the pump itself, or again, we could have a restriction. There's a screen located in the base of the heater. There's a little diesel heater in there. There's a kit where you can eliminate that whole heater system, because if sometimes they develop leaks, so they could be a problem with air infiltration and other issues. But before I go through all of that, because all of that is down there and harder to get to, why don't I just see whether or not it's a simple fix of replacing this valve. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you where those lines are, because this line coming out here, the return line, it's a steel line, and it goes back along the block, goes down by the firewall, and then it transitions to a rubber line. So that rubber line, you can use some hose pliers and crimp it off. So I don't have a dedicated pair of hose pliers, but I've got these duckbill, like platypus style vice grips, and I can use this to crimp the line and it won't damage the rubber line. That's why I like using these as opposed to just a regular pair of vice grips. If you don't have that, you could use a pair of vice grips, but maybe just wrap some cardboard or something around the line first to kind of protect the jaws, protect the hose from the serrated jaws of your vice grips. All right, so I'm underneath the truck and I'm looking up towards the front, and you can actually see the two lines that come down, the two steel lines. They actually transition through these connectors to these stainless steel braided lines. There's two of them. They then in turn come down here and transition to rubber lines right here. Now this may look a little different than the stock setup, and that's because years ago these lines were in really bad shape and I had them replaced. So this is actually, these two rubber lines you see here are a little bit heavier duty marine grade fuel line that is an improvement over the stock stuff. But you can see the two lines, actually that cutoff line that is showing up right there, that's actually the old line. They just cut the line right there and left it and put in the new lines. So there's two lines. If you look at the size of the steel lines, one line is larger than the other. So the larger line is the supply and the smaller line is the return. So in my case, the smaller line is the one on the bottom here. So I know that of these two rubber hoses, it's the bottom one that is my return line. So that's what I'm going to crimp onto. So hopefully that's focusing and showing you guys what I'm doing here. But I'm just crimping that line like that. I'm just doing it ahead of time to show you what I'm actually going to be doing under the truck while you guys are up watching that fuel gauge, that fuel pressure gauge. All right, so I'm going to get in and I'm going to start the truck, and we'll see it'll go back up to about the 21, 22 mark, and then I'm going to get underneath the truck and I'm going to crimp that line. And you'll be able to tell when I crimp that line, because if the pump is working correctly, that pressure will rise.
Clip the line and you can see it shot way up. Pushing like 45 psi, and that's at idle. And now I've unclamped the line and it drops back down.
So I now believe that I need to replace this bypass valve, and I've got a couple of different choices. I could get the stock Bosch valve, but I actually have heard several people online that said that this Torque Tech brand of valve, which I guess is adjustable, is actually better made. Some guys have claimed that they bought the Bosch one only to have it fail in a short amount of time. Of course, it's also possible that some of those guys may be buying what they think are genuine Bosch parts that are actually Chinese knockoffs. I mean, there's plenty of those floating around too. There's also knockoffs of the Torque Techs that are out there. But I think I'm just going to bite the bullet. It's like $49.95 for the genuine Torque Tech one, and we'll see what happens. All right, so I got my parts in. So what I ended up ordering was I ended up ordering the overflow valve, and I also ordered the snubber valve. So I already made, basically made a port on there for my fuel pressure gauge on the old one by drilling that hole and tapping it. But I decided, since it was only like $23 and change to get the TorqueTech brand of snubber, I figured I'd get that. So what the snubber does is the snubber actually has an orifice in here that allows you to not have the pulsing problem of the needle, the fluctuation on the needle with the pulsing of the pump pressure. So that's why I did that. Now, you guys notice that on the gauge on that tester that I borrowed from the auto parts store, I wasn't having that problem. And that's because the fitting that came with the tester had a built-in snubber. But I figure at some point down the road, I might want to get one of those gauge-mounted, mounted gauge clusters in the cab with a fuel and boost gauge on it. And with those, typically you need to have one of these snubber bolts. So I'm going to change that out. I bought all these parts from Pure Diesel Power out of Wisconsin. I did a lot of checking around. Price-wise, they were very reasonable, especially when you factored in the shipping. So I ended up getting the CBS 010 TorqueTech snubber. Again, this is a 9712 valve, so it uses the 14mm banjo bolt. And the TorqueTech adjustable overflow valve. So I can actually adjust this valve to increase the pressure if I want. And I believe it comes set from the factory from TorqueTech for between 30 and 32 psi, which is perfectly fine for my stock motor here. Now, I opted for the OFV 020. They also have an OFV 010. Both of them are for the 94 to 98 12 valves with the P7100 pump, which is what I have here. But the difference is the 020 is actually designed so that it can tolerate fuels that have like biodiesel fuels and things like that. And I was reading online and found out that the reason why the other valve might not stand up to that as well is because I think it has a regular spring in it, a regular steel spring in it. Whereas I think this has a stainless steel spring. So the components in this are basically going to be able to stand up to that kind of fuel that might, I guess, have more water content in it or something. I'm not exactly sure why, but I do know that the 010 was $46.95, and this one, the 020, was $49.95. It was $3 more. And I even read somewhere on one of the other like forums or whatever, somebody was even commenting about how that other valve really at this point is kind of obsolete, because for $3 more, why wouldn't you want this one? You know, unless somebody could tell me otherwise. I think I made a better choice here by paying the $3 extra for this sucker. I did see this, very similar type of valve with the adjustment on it, and even different colored anodized metals that made it look pretty all over the internet. But they weren't TorqueTech brand ones. They were aftermarket ones. Most of those are probably coming in from China. This one here is, according to TorqueTech, proudly made in the USA. So why don't we just stay with that, right?
It's China to me, China.
The Chinese ones were still like $30.
I have to have my China.
So to me, it was it's just not worth it. Plus, I just like the idea of staying with the TorqueTech one, because I just kept seeing TorqueTech pop up on forum after forum after forum, people saying that this is what they went with. So I'm just going to change out the banjo bolt first. All right, I've got the new fuel snubber fitting installed, and I figure what I'll do is I'll do one more pressure test before I replace that adjustment valve, just so I can have a real direct comparison of before and after. Why am I getting no fuel pressure? So I checked all my connections, and then very slowly the pressure started coming up. And I think what's going on here is I think that snubber is actually doing a really good job. And I think the built-in snubber on this tester is combining with the other snubber and just causing a real big restriction. So it's taken a while for it to build pressure. Yeah, so I sure am glad that I rechecked this, because now I can go off of this baseline reading and see whether or not my pressure increases when I replace that overflow valve. So here's a tip for you. I just removed the snubber valve. It's kind of tight to work in here and a little hard to see, but you could take the radiator hose and actually push it up and just squeeze it behind the oil fill, and that opens up this whole area right here. And that allowed me to work from standing in the front of the truck and work this out. So there's a little bit of a cutout here on the head that gives you some clearance, but you still have to kind of bend this up, this banjo fitting up a little bit to get this out. And the other thing is, as soon as you want to back this out, the crush washer, the copper washer in here, is going to want to fall out and get lost down in there. So I just kind of made sure that I had my hand underneath there and was able to just get my finger on it, or you could get a little screwdriver in there to just hold it so it doesn't drop down into the abyss. In case I didn't mention it, these new washers, seals that need to go onto the banjo bolt, you don't want to put these on dry. You want to give them a little bit of lubrication. I've got this container of the diesel fuel that I drained off when I was taking the old banjo fitting out, and that has enough lubrication in it. So you got to be careful not to drop that other seal. In fact, there isn't even enough room to get this. Well, there's just enough room, I guess, to get this closed into the wrench on there. Alright, so just like the other fitting, supposed to torque this to 24 foot-pounds. I don't have any special doohickeys or anything that are going to let me actually put like an offset torque wrench situation here. So I am just going to snug it up pretty decent. And then I'll start it and I'll check for leaks. Alright, let's start it up again and see if we see a change in the fuel pressure at idle. Yeah, I like that. That's like at like 26 PSI at idle. I've got my idle up a little high for those of you who didn't notice. That's like 30 PSI on the dot, which is exactly what they preset these valves for at the factory. So I'm quite happy with that.